This is GMT's East Front Series game, Barbarossa Army Group South. Plan on playing a solo game. It's set up with the OB that was in the rule book or the playbook for the campaign game. There's a revised Soviet setup, but this is not that. Mostly, I believe the big differences in that, or in this area, the Soviet mechanized forces are not here like they are in this particular version of the setup. So these units, motorized units, will not be able to move on game turn 1. Some of these in the playbook don't say these two units, these two stacks, that you can't move them on game turn 1, but the Vassal module has them as not being able to move on game turn 1, so that's how I'm going to play it for this scenario. The some of the rules I'm going to be using, let's see. For Panzer Integrity, the newer game, Crimea, they've changed some, or maybe it was Kiev to Rostov. It's Kiev to Rostov. They changed the Panzer Integrity rule a bit. They tweaked it. You only need the armor part of the Panzer division and one other asset instead of two others. So instead of needing 3 parts of the Panzer division to get Panzer Integrity, you only needed 2. But I'm going to play that the rule in Army Group South, which is you need to have all 3, or you need to have 3 parts of the Panzer division to actually receive Panzer Integrity. I'm not going to be using some of the other rules that are in the more current games. I won't be using the, let's see, the engineer ability that allows you to overstack and engineer if you're attacking a strong point. I won't be using that. I am going to be using the strong regimental substitution counters, the the 225s. When a division or when a German infantry unit or SS unit, when you take a regiment off and it drops it down by 2 points, 2 factors, I'll be using the 225 instead of the 125. I'm also going to be using the Romanian substitution counter as well, which came in the Crimea game, but I'm going to be using it in this game. Also, I'm going to do a chit pull for the weather. I won't be rolling for weather. So I'm going to put game turn 6 through 15 in a cup. So I'll have 10 chits for the historic weather of those 10 turns. I'll draw a chit, and then I will place the next game turn's chit in the cup. So there'll always be 10 chits in the cup. I'm only going to allow 2 mud turns in a row. I think 3 is too many. 3 would actually allow. Actually, I am going to play fuel shortage for the Germans. So 3 mud turns in a row after game turn 10 could potentially put the German motorized units out of fuel. Even though they would be, if it was clear, could be in supply. So I'm only going to allow 2. If the third one's mud, I'm just going to draw another chit until it's clear or clear with storms. And then I'll put the mud chit back in. So I'm only going to allow 2 mud chits in a row. 2 mud turns in a row. What else? I'm not going to allow the Germans to move into a zone of control on the first game turn. So these guys right here would not be able to move here, even though they could freely move along the border. The Russian units do not exert a zone of control into Poland, from East Poland. They do exert zones of control within East Poland, but I'm not going to allow them to just move across the border because that would allow, for example, here, the Germans to move here, which would nullify the Russian defenses. But technically, this is a special case where you wouldn't even be able to do that anyway, I suppose, because there's a fortified line there. But I'm not going to allow any sort of German movement across the border within zones of control. All the attacks on game turn 1 will be supplied for the Germans, regardless of how far from the border they are. In Army Group South, the rule is you only get to supply an attack on or adjacent to the border, I believe. But I'm going to allow all attacks, and I'm not even sure that there could be any attacks further than on or adjacent, although I suppose that one would be, because this would be adjacent, because that's technically the border. So, but I'm going to allow all attacks to be supplied on game turn 1. Okay, one of the issues on game turn 1 for the Germans is what to do with your rail capacity. You have 6 rail stacking points that you can use. You can rail up your supply, or you can rail up units that cannot move on game turn 1. Units that can move on game turn 1 are any units that are on or adjacent to the border. So this unit cannot move because that is a border hex, and that would be adjacent. So all these units, most motorized units, except for this one and these, cannot move on game turn 1 unless you move them by rail. So that's this decision the German has to make. The German player has to make. Do you rail up 3 parts of a panzer division or all of a motorized division, which I guess you could rail this guy up, or them. Yeah, I guess or them. Do you rail up 3 units, 6 stacking points, or do you rail up supply? The Germans get 6 supply on game turn 1. You can rail them all up. You can rail, them right to the front, and allow them to be moved on game turn 2. For example, follow your breakthrough. If you break through here, which it's kind of a smart thing to do. That's where all your shit is. Excuse me. You could then move your supplies up on game turn 2 to allow for supplied attacks on game turn 2. If you rail up for example, 3 pieces of the 13th Panzer, then you could not do that. I don't know. The one thing that I'll tell you is that if you rail the Panzer, the armor of 13th Panzer, one of the motorized regiments, and the recon battalion of 13th Panzer, if you rail it up, excuse me, you can trap all of these units, or most of them, It all depends on there's an attack over here if it fails or if it succeeds. You can trap all of this. Not only can you trap all of this, but it puts the 6th headquarters, which cannot move on game turn 1, it puts it in peril. And I'm not sure you can even save it from being eliminated. It puts some severe pressure on the Soviets in the Lav area. If you just rail up 3 parts of that Panzer division, it changes the whole complexion of the fight here. Is it worth it? Is it worth not bringing up the supply? Yeah, I don't know. It's certainly, as a Soviet player, I've played against that move, and it really, really makes it tough. You can do it. You can defend Lov, and you can keep it for 5 game turns against some heavy German pressure. 11th Panzer is the key. If the 11th Panzer is able to actually break through on this side, then Lov is in big trouble. It really is. However, there is a German penalty for that. If you don't go after Brody, if you don't go up this road, a lot of Soviet units can get away. It's just, if you spend your time taking Lov, a lot of the stuff that you could potentially trap, you can't trap. If the Soviets want to bug out. So that's interesting. It's really, it depends on what the Germans do with 11th Panzer. The 13th Panzer, if they rail it up, they can trap these and also probably eliminate the 6th headquarters on game turn 2. They don't necessarily need to use 11th Panzer to help unless they want to take Lov. Try to take Lov before game turn 5 and get the 4 victory points. I believe that 11th Panzer should go towards Brody or in this general area. Not that way. There is a weak point in the Soviet line, and that is here. There gets to be a point where all these units are gone, and these units are defending, trying to slowly defend back, or quickly defend back, whichever the case may be. And there gets to be a weak point right in here that can be exploited by the Germans, if they choose to. Okay, that's this area. Now, in this area, the German player, regardless of what happens here, must try, in my opinion, to keep the Soviet player from moving these assets back to Kovel. The 5th headquarters, which is in Kovel, and the artillery units are basically on their own. They're goners. You can't run fast enough to get out. The 5th headquarters is going to be eliminated, whether it's overran or just attacked. They can run it down. So it's almost impossible, unless you're playing against inept German player. It's almost impossible to get the 5th headquarters out of there and survive. The Soviet player, if you allow him, will be able to move these 2 3-step Soviet infantry divisions back to Kovel. And if they do that, if you let them do that, you will have a defense of, there's 10 plus 5 artillery and the headquarters for a total of 16 defense. 16 defensive factors with a headquarters that can give orders for a no retreat. if you allow that to happen, you are running the risk of severely delaying your rail line. This rail line will supply the German army in this area of the board, right? So you need to take Kovel and take it quickly. You have to stop the Russian player from retreating these units to Kovel. And how do you do that? Well, you take your motorized units here and you move them through the marsh. That's how I do it. Is I take them. These guys can move on game turn 1. They cannot. They're not on a rail line, so you can't rail them. So these guys can move, and they can move all the way up to here on game turn 1. You put a bridge unit right here from this hex to this hex, and they can move all the way to here on their movement phase. Their exploitation phase, or their motorized phase, on the first 2 game turns, they can move their full movement. You move them up to here and block that road, keeping these units from retreating back to Kovel. And that is how you, now the Soviets can bring up units this way, but nothing like these units. Okay. And quite frankly, the Soviets have, first of all, these units cannot move on the first game turn. So there's limited assets that they can get here. And it probably, maybe getting one of them there, it's hard even to do that. You can almost block that as well, if I recall. But it makes life so much easier for the German player if you isolate Kovel and let nothing get there and take it as quickly as possible. You want this rail line to be screaming along. Otherwise, you're not going to supply the German army. Part of the problem is with the chit pull, and there's a chance of early mud with the chit pull. I think it's about 50-50, which if you're rolling for it, it's 70-30, I believe, clear to mud. So it probably it averages out the same over the course of the 28 game turns. But the first 10 game turns, if you do a chit pull, historically, half were mud. So the Germans need their rail, and they need to advance their railhead as rapidly as possible, because they're going to only be able to have a 15 hex road supply line during mud, and then 5 overland, so 20. So it's important to increase your rail with the chit pull, and it's probably important anyway, but with the chit pull, I think I hate to use the word especially, because people use that way too often, especially this, especially that, but if you're going to allow a 50-50 chance for mud, then rail conversion is very important. So I think Kovel is very, very important for the Germans to take quickly. Okay. So the question also is do you go for Brody, or do you try to take Lov? I don't know. I am in favor of sending 11th Panzer through the hole that you're going to create and go down the road and head right for Brody. Put pressure this way. The Soviets are severely lacking in forces right here. And you'll see that as the game plays out. Hopefully you'll see that. I'm not too stupid and make a mess of the whole thing. So I think that's probably about it. Yeah, we're at about 20 minutes. So anything else that I should talk about? I'm going to allow, in Armed Group South, They allow for bridge placement during the movement phase, which to me makes sense in the here, if I can find it. Here we go. In the like master sequence of play from the Crimea rulebook, I've got this vast sequence of play that covers many sheets. 3 sheets. So not many, but 3. When they changed this, I'm not sure if it was the Crimea game or Kiev to Rostov, but anyway, bridge units, according to this, are to be placed in the supply determination phase. Now, that makes it harder for the Germans, because you've got to look ahead. Where do I want to, what am I going to do? Where am I going to move my units? Where should I put the bridge units? So it makes it a little harder for the Germans. You got to think before you start moving on what your plan is. That's one thing. But it makes it impossible for the Soviets. Like, how do you place a bridge unit before you even know what the Germans have done? Right? You've got to place it in the supply determination phase, and the Germans haven't even done their turn yet. So you don't even know where they're attacking. So I can see where you could, there are common sense things. Yeah, you put it over the Dnieper. You could do that when you're falling back and you're going to cross over the Dnieper in a turn or two. Yeah, put one up. It takes a turn to put a bridge unit up across a major river. So yeah, that I get. You know where you're going to be, if you're going to be funneled back into a certain place and there's no bridge there, you realize you can get your guys across the Dnieper by putting up one of your temporary bridges. But other than that, how on earth would you ever use a Soviet bridge unit across any little river? I just don't understand. I mean, I guess I suppose in here maybe, I don't know. You could put a bridge unit in here if you know, like in a turn or two, that you're going to be, well, you're not even going to be defending up here, probably. More than likely, this is your first line of defense. Right here is the Styr River. So it just seems, maybe here, it seems just almost, I've never even used a bridge unit for the Soviets except across the Dnieper. Other than that, it's like you don't, it seems like it makes it really bad. So I'm gonna allow the placement of bridge units during the during the movement phase of each player's turn. So the Soviets can place their bridge units during the mechanized phase, and the Germans place their bridge units during their movement phase. So, and I'm going to be moving the Soviets exactly like the sequence of play says. I'm not going to try to make it easier on myself and move the Soviet infantry and motorized together if they're not going to do any attacks, and then move the motorized after the fact. I think it makes it too easy for the Soviets to set up a defense. One thing that the Soviets had trouble, or have trouble doing in this game, is setting up some sort of a coordinated defense when you have to move your motorized first and you don't move your infantry at all. And then you move your motorized half and your infantry full afterwards. You've got to really, really know what you're doing to set up any sort of coordinated defense. You sort of get used to it, and you can figure it out. But at first, that's pretty tough to do. And even when you play the game enough, you make mistakes as a Soviet player, I think. So I'm going to dispense with the urge of making it easier on myself as a Soviet player, and I'm going to actually do the sequence of play properly and move the Soviet mechanized first. And then another thing is when you start doing that, then it starts getting weird, because you do rail movement, and you're going to be doing rail movement before you're going to be moving the Soviets their half movement, which is not technically what is correct, but you're going to be potentially confusing strategic movement, because the Soviets there's no strategic movement in the motorized phase, and that's when the Soviet motorized get to move full, and you tend to start mixing it all up. So I'm not going to do that. Anyway, okay, that's the setup.